The garage door was already half open when Mason Creed killed the engine of his Harley. The metal still trembled from a forceful impact. For one frozen second, he just sat there, one boot on the gravel, hands locked around the handlebars, staring into the darkness inside the old family shop. Something was wrong. Dead wrong. The smell hit him first, burnt oil, hot metal, and blood. "Grandpa?" His voice tore through the silence, rough from 12 years of roads, bar fights, and too many nights spent becoming the man this town once said he'd never survive to become. No answer. Mason pushed the garage door higher. It screeched upward, and then he saw him. Walter Creed, 79 years old, the man who had raised him after his parents died, the man who built Creed Auto and Iron with his bare hands in 1974. The man who taught him how to rebuild a carburetor before he was old enough to drive, lying on the concrete floor in a pool of blackened oil and blood. His gray flannel shirt was soaked at the shoulder. One side of his face was purple, his breathing shallow, barely there. Tools were scattered everywhere, a torque wrench bent in half, drawers ripped from the workbench, the old glass display case shattered, and right beside Walter's hand, half soaked in oil, was a thick white envelope stamped in red. Final eviction notice. Mason froze. Then something inside him snapped so hard it felt physical. "Grandpa!" He dropped to his knees so fast the concrete slammed into his bones. Walter groaned, still alive. Thank God. Mason slid one hand under the old man's shoulders, careful, controlled, though every muscle in his body was screaming for violence. Hey, stay with me." Walter's eyelids twitched. His cloudy blue eyes opened just enough to find Mason's face. For a moment, confusion flickered there, then recognition and pain. "You came back," Walter whispered. The words hit harder than anything Mason had heard in years, because beneath the pain there was something worse. Relief. Like the old man had already accepted nobody was coming, like he had been alone in this. For how long? Mason swallowed the rage clawing up his throat. "I'm here now." Walter's cracked lips moved. They took the papers. Who? But Walter's eyes drifted toward the broken office door, toward the wall where the framed land deed used to hang. It was gone. Mason looked up slowly. The office had been destroyed, file cabinets dumped, old ledgers ripped apart, tax folders everywhere, the safe door hanging open, not robbery, targeted. Someone had come here for one thing, the land. The shop sat on 12 acres right off the new bypass project, prime developer territory. Mason knew immediately what this was. Greed. Corporate scavengers circling old blood. His jaw tightened. Who did this? Walter tried to lift his trembling hand. His fingers closed weakly around Mason's vest. Hayes Development. The name landed like gasoline on fire. Victor Hayes, local developer. Rich, political, untouchable, the same man buying half the county, the same man who'd spent the last 2 years pressuring old landowners to sell, the same man who'd offered Walter money 3 months ago. Walter had laughed him off the property, said the Creedland would stay Creedland until the day he died. Mason had only heard about it from a brother passing through Nevada. At the time, he thought it was just another land shark sniffing around. Now Walter was bleeding on the floor. Now it was war. Mason reached for his phone and called 911. His voice stayed calm, cold, controlled. It scared him more than yelling ever could, because this was the version of him his enemies never survived. "Emergency services. My grandfather's been assaulted. Creed Auto and Iron, Route 16. As the dispatcher spoke, Mason's eyes scanned the floor. A muddy boot print. Expensive tread, not work boots, city boots, and near the office threshold, a gold cufflink, initials engraved, V.H. Victor Hayes. The arrogant bastard had either been here himself or sent someone too stupid to clean up. Good. That meant fear hadn't reached them yet, but it would. Sirens were still minutes away. Mason took off his leather cut and draped it over Walter's chest. The old man shivered. They said, "It belongs to them now." "No," Mason said quietly. His eyes locked on the foreclosure notice. His voice dropped lower, deadlier. "It still belongs to us." Walter stared at him through pain and exhaustion. For the first time since Mason had arrived, something changed in the old man's face. Not fear, hope. Outside, the sound of engines rolled across the gravel lot. Not ambulances, motorcycles, 3 of them. Mason didn't even need to look. Only one group of men rode into silence like thunder waiting to happen. His charter. The Nevada Death Valley chapter. The brothers he had called the moment he crossed county lines. They had arrived faster than the law. Always did. Mason rose slowly from the floor. His grandfather's blood still wet on his hands. His face empty now, controlled. The dangerous kind of calm. The garage lights flickered above the shattered shop. The old creed sign swung on one loose chain. And Mason looked at the ruined legacy of the only man who had ever truly been his family. Victor Hayes had made one fatal mistake. He thought an old man was alone. He had no idea whose bloodline he had just touched. The 3 Harleys rolled into the gravel lot like judgment. Headlights cut across the shattered garage windows, sweeping over broken glass, spilled oil, and the old creed sign hanging crooked above the bay doors. Mason stepped outside before the bikes even stopped. Reaper dismounted first, 6'4", shaved head, gray beard braided tight, his leather vest carrying the Nevada Death Valley President patch under Mason's national insignia. Behind him came Jax Mercer and Hollow Reed, both old road captains who had ridden with Mason long enough to recognize the look on his face before he spoke. Reaper's eyes dropped to the blood on Mason's hands. Who? 2 seconds. That was all it took for the air to change. The playful road energy they'd arrived with vanished. Now it was business. Mason looked back toward the garage. My grandfather. Jax cursed under his breath and moved immediately toward the entrance. Hollow stayed beside Mason, reading the scene the way old soldiers read battlefields. No ambulance yet? 3 minutes out. Reaper stepped closer, voice low. Tell me what happened. Mason held up the gold cufflink. The engraved VH caught the moonlight. Victor Hayes. The 3 men went still. Everyone in this county knew the name. Hayes Development had been buying land for the new bypass expansion for over a year. Farms, machine shops, junkyards, diners, even churches, if the land sat close enough to the projected route. People who sold called it luck. People who refused usually changed their minds after accidents, inspections, tax problems, or legal notices started showing up. But nobody had ever touched Creed land. Not until tonight. Reaper looked toward the shattered office. He finally pushed too far. Mason's stare hardened. He crossed into family. That word meant something different in their world. Not sentimental. Absolute. Inside the garage, Walter groaned again. Jax's voice echoed from inside. He's got a fractured shoulder, maybe ribs. Old man's tough as railroad steel, though. Mason turned and went back in. Walter's eyes were half open now, drifting between faces as the brothers moved around him with surprising care. Hollow knelt beside him, laying a folded shop rag against the wound near his temple. Sir, stay with us. Walter squinted up at the patches. For a second, his old mechanic instincts overrode the pain. Hell's angels, he muttered. Mason crouched beside him. They're with me. Walter let out the faintest breath that almost sounded like a laugh. Guess they picked the wrong damn garage. Even half-conscious, the old man still had steel. That lit something darker in Mason's chest. Because men like Victor Hayes only targeted people they thought were weak, old, isolated, easy. They had no idea Walter Creed had spent 40 years rebuilding engines for half the outlaw riders west of Nevada. No idea how many patched men still owed this garage favors. Sirens finally wailed in the distance. Mason stood and stepped outside before the sheriff's deputies arrived, and when the first cruiser pulled into the lot, his mood turned colder. Sheriff Nolan Pierce climbed out. Expensive boots, fresh-pressed uniform, silver watch that cost more than most people's rent, and the second Mason saw him, he understood. Pierce and Victor Hayes played golf together every Sunday at Canyon Ridge. Town gossip, public knowledge, corruption didn't even hide anymore. Pierce took one look at Mason's vest and frowned. Mr. Creed. Mason didn't answer. The sheriff's flashlight moved past him toward the garage. What happened here? Ask Victor Hayes. That got the sheriff's attention, only for a second. Then the mask returned. Careful with accusations. Mason stepped closer, close enough to make the deputy behind Pierce tense. Inside the garage, the paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. An 80-year-old man was beaten half to death in his own shop, Mason said quietly, and I found Hayes's cufflink on the floor. Pierce's expression didn't change. That proves nothing. Of course it didn't, because it wasn't about proof. It was about control. Pierce wanted this contained before it became a county scandal, before the bypass investors got nervous, before the Creed land became untouchable. Mason saw all of it in one look. Then the sheriff made his mistake. We also found a signed foreclosure transfer in county records this afternoon. Mason went still. What? Pierce pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Stamped, signed, filed, transfer of ownership, Creed Auto and Iron, signed by Walter Creed. Except Mason didn't need more than one glance to know the signature was fake. Walter signed with a mechanic's heavy slant. This was clean. Corporate. Forged. Mason's pulse slowed. That dangerous stillness again. You filed forged papers. Pierce's jaw flexed. I'm saying the county recognizes Hayes Development as the current legal owner pending civil review. Behind them, Reaper and Hollow stepped out of the garage. Neither spoke. They just stood there. Silent walls of leather and muscle. Pierce noticed. His deputies noticed too. The balance of fear in the parking lot shifted. Good. Mason folded the paper once, twice, then handed it back. Then tomorrow morning I'm walking into county records. Pierce gave a thin smile. You're welcome to. It was smug. Too smug. Meaning they thought every trail was already cleaned. Judges bought, clerks paid, documents replaced. The kind of system rich men build when they think nobody can hit back. But Victor Hayes had never fought someone who understood war in layers. Mason didn't need fists yet. He needed leverage. Inside the ambulance, Walter was being loaded in. The old man caught Mason's sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. Desk drawer. Mason leaned closer. Left side. False bottom. Then Walter was gone behind closing doors. The ambulance pulled away into the night, and Mason stood there watching the red lights disappear. False bottom. Walter had hidden something Hayes didn't find. Maybe the real deed. Maybe old land surveys. Maybe something worth killing for. Mason slowly turned back toward the broken garage. His brothers already understood. The real fight wasn't tomorrow. It started tonight. Inside that office. Inside the one place Victor Hayes thought he had already emptied. The moment Sheriff Pierce's cruisers disappeared down Route 16, the night belonged to Mason. Cold, silent, predatory. The kind of silence that comes before a storm tears through dry country. The shattered garage stood behind him like a wounded animal. Its broken windows reflected the glow of the lot lights and the chrome of 3 Harleys waiting in the gravel. Mason walked back inside without a word. Reaper shut the bay door behind them. Metal slammed into place. Now it was just the 4 of them, and the ruined legacy of Walter Creed. The office looked worse under full light. Every drawer had been dumped, old tax boxes split open, decades of receipts, titles, invoices, handwritten repair logs scattered across the floor like dead leaves. Victor Hayes' men hadn't been searching randomly. They had known exactly where to look. That meant one thing. They believed something inside this office could stop the land transfer. Mason moved behind Walter's old oak desk. The same desk where he had done homework as a kid while Walter rebuilt carburetors and talked about torque ratios like bedtime stories. For a second, memory hit hard. The smell of coffee, grease under Walter's fingernails, rain tapping the shop windows. You don't ever sell what your blood built, boy. Walter had said that when Mason was 12. At the time, it was about motorcycles. Tonight, it meant war. Left drawer, Mason muttered. He pulled it open. Wrenches, title stamps, old mechanic pencils. Nothing unusual. He dumped everything onto the desktop and ran his fingers along the inside panel. Solid oak, then a hollow sound. Reaper stepped closer. There, Mason pressed harder. A thin wooden plate shifted, a false bottom. The hidden panel lifted. Inside was a sealed oilcloth packet, dry despite the chaos. Walter had protected it long before tonight. Mason unwrapped it carefully. 3 things: a folded land deed, a yellowed survey map, and an old photograph. The deed came first. Original ownership papers, Creed Auto and Iron, 1974. Walter's real signature, county seal, permanent inheritance clause. No forced sale unless next of kin signs in person. Mason's eyes narrowed. Victor Hayes couldn't legally take the land with forged county paperwork if this original was registered with inheritance protection. So why risk violence? Why come personally? The answer was in the second document, the survey map. Reaper leaned over Mason's shoulder. What the hell's that? The property lines weren't normal. The shop itself sat on the front 12 acres, but behind it, another section, unregistered. 27 acres of undeclared land extending into the canyon ridge. No bypass route touched it, no commercial value, at least not obvious value. Hollow studied the markings. There's an old mine shaft back here. Mason looked closer. A faded notation in Walter's handwriting, Creed Ridge Access Tunnel, sealed 1986 a tunnel. Now the whole thing shifted. This was never about the garage alone. Victor Hayes wanted what was under the ridge, minerals, storage, something hidden, something big enough to beat an old man half to death. Then Mason picked up the photograph, and the room went dead still. The picture was black and white, 4 men standing in front of the same garage in 1982. Walter, younger, harder, a man Mason immediately recognized as his late father. Another patched Hell's Angel from the old Nevada charter, and standing beside them, a much younger Victor Hayes, no suit, no polished smile, leather jacket, grease on his hands, standing in their family garage like he belonged there. What the hell? Jax whispered. Mason stared at the photo. Victor Hayes wasn't an outsider circling family land. He had history here. Personal history. Which meant tonight wasn't business, it was unfinished betrayal. On the back of the photo, Walter had written one line. He came back for what we buried. No explanation, no names, just that. Reaper exhaled slowly. This just became bigger than land theft. Mason's jaw locked. His father died in a canyon fire 22 years ago. Official report, fuel explosion during a storm. Case closed. Walter had never believed it, neither had Mason. Now, Victor Hayes' face sat in an old family photo tied to a sealed ridge tunnel and a hidden inheritance deed. The dead had just stepped back into the room. Hollow moved toward the survey map. If there's something in that tunnel, Hayes is going to move fast, especially now that he knows Walter hid the real papers. Mason already knew. Tonight's assault had failed. Walter survived. The real deed still existed. Hayes would hit harder next. Legal pressure, arson, another hospital attack, maybe worse. Mason folded the deed and tucked it into the inside pocket of his cut, close to his chest. The photo followed. The map stayed open on the desk. He traced the old ridge road with one finger. A dirt access path ran behind the property and disappeared into canyon stone. Unmarked, forgotten. Perfect. Jax looked at him. You're thinking tunnel. I'm thinking answers. Reaper crossed his arms. Then we move before sunrise. Mason nodded once, no hesitation, because somewhere under that ridge was the reason Victor Hayes risked exposing himself, the reason Walter never sold, the reason Mason's father died. And if Hayes wanted it badly enough to spill family blood, then whatever lay in that sealed tunnel was the key to destroying him. Outside, thunder rolled over the Nevada hills. A storm moving in, fast, the kind Walter always called miner's weather. Mason stared at the old photo one last time. Victor Hayes smiling beside his father, like brothers, like partners, like men who once trusted each other. Then he looked toward the black ridge beyond the garage. Tomorrow morning the county would think Hayes owned Creed Auto and Iron. But before the law opened its doors, Mason was going to the grave Victor Hayes had just dug back open. The tunnel under Creed Ridge, the place his grandfather had hidden from the world for nearly 40 years. The place where his father's ghost was waiting. They left before dawn. No words, no wasted motion, just the low thunder of 4 Harleys cutting through the dark behind Creed Auto and Iron as storm clouds rolled over the ridge like black smoke. Mason rode first. The old survey map was folded inside his vest, the edges warm against his chest beside the original deed and the photograph that had already rewritten half his life. The dirt access road behind the garage hadn't been used in decades. Tall brush scraped against the bikes, loose stones cracked under heavy tires. The climb twisted higher into canyon country where the wind smelled of wet dust, pine sap, and rain. Behind him, Reaper's headlights stayed steady. Jack's and Hollow flanked the rear. No one needed to say it. Everyone understood this ride had crossed out of property dispute territory. Now it was blood history. The ridge opened suddenly, a wide stone shelf overlooking the valley. From here, Mason could see the glow of town lights below, the bypass construction cranes, Hayes development floodlights in the distance. Victor was already building the future on stolen bones, but what mattered stood 50 yards ahead. A rusted steel gate embedded into the mountain itself, half buried in dirt and old storm runoff. The faded warning sign still clung to one chain. Danger, Creed Ridge. Access closed. Hollow whistled low. This place feels like a grave. Mason killed the engine and dismounted. It probably is. The padlock on the gate had been cut recently. Fresh metal, clean edges. Victor's people had already been here, but they hadn't gone inside. Not yet. The steel door behind the gate remained sealed by a horizontal wheel lock Walter must have installed years ago. Reaper shined his flashlight over the stone. There. Fresh boot prints, 3 sets, leading up to the entrance, stopping, turning back. Jax crouched beside the dirt. They came prepared for a quick hit. Probably couldn't get through. Mason stepped closer to the wheel lock. The mechanism was old but intact. A 6-spoke industrial seal built into the tunnel frame, and scratched into the metal plate beneath it was one word. Creed, not a code, a reminder. Walter built this to stay in family hands. Mason wiped away decades of dust. Under the family name sat a smaller inscription, a date, June 14, 2002, the day his father died. His pulse slowed, everything in him sharpened. Victor Hayes had returned for something buried the same day Mason's father was declared dead in a canyon explosion. This wasn't coincidence. This was the reason. Reaper stepped beside him. You know how to open it? Mason stared at the locking wheel. Then memory hit. A boy of 14 standing beside Walter in the garage office, his grandfather teaching him the old Creed lock sequence used on shop safes and hidden parts lockers. Right 2 turns, left 1, half turn back, pull. Same family engineering logic. He grabbed the wheel, cold iron bit into his palms. Right, 2 turns, left, 1, half back. A loud metallic clunk echoed through the ridge. The tunnel door unsealed. Behind them, thunder cracked across the sky. Jax gave a grim smile. Guess Grandpa wanted you to be the one. Mason pulled the steel door open. A breath of cold underground air spilled out, dry, mineral heavy, and carrying something else. Ash, old fire ash. His father's death suddenly felt very close. The tunnel sloped downward into darkness, reinforced beams, old mining tracks, power cables long dead. But someone had been maintaining parts of it. Fresh footprints led inward, and halfway down the first chamber, a modern generator. Off, covered, hidden under a tarp. Victor's men had definitely found the tunnel. They just hadn't reached what they wanted yet. Mason moved deeper, flashlight cutting through dust. The walls changed from natural stone to reinforced timber. This wasn't just an abandoned mine. Someone had converted it. Storage. Long-term concealment. At the first junction, the tunnel split. Left path collapsed. Right path continued toward a sealed chamber door. Walter's handwriting was painted on the timber beam overhead. Keep buried. Jack stared at it. That's not exactly comforting. Mason stepped toward the chamber. The steel door was newer than the rest, installed maybe 20 years ago, the year his father died. Another Creed lock wheel, but this one had been scorched black, burn marks, blast residue. Mason touched the steel. The metal still carried warped blistering from extreme heat. His father had died in a fire. Inside this mountain, not out in the canyon, Walter had moved the story, buried the truth. Reaper's voice dropped. Brother, someone lied to you. Mason's jaw tightened so hard it hurt. Walter hadn't just hidden land papers, he had hidden a death scene, maybe a murder scene. He opened the second lock. The chamber door groaned wide. Inside stood shelves, metal cases, fuel drums, crates stamped with military surplus markings, and in the center, a burned Harley frame, half melted, the same custom frame his father rode. Mason recognized the front fork immediately. a hand-built eagle engraving on the neck stem. He had polished it with his father when he was 8. The bike had never exploded in a canyon. It died here, inside the chamber, under Creed Ridge. But what froze him wasn't the Harley. It was the crate behind it, stamped with Hayes Industrial Logistics. Date: June 2002. Victor Hayes's company had been moving illegal fuel storage through Creedland 22 years ago. Hazmat. Unregistered military fuel cells, smuggled through the Ridge Tunnel. His father must have found out, tried to stop it, and died for it. Hollow slowly opened another crate. Inside were ledgers, shipping manifests, cash books, names, politicians, sheriff departments, construction firms, bribes spanning 20 years. Victor Hayes hadn't built an empire through development. He built it through smuggling, land laundering, and political corruption rooted in this tunnel. The garage was only the surface. This mountain was the real kingdom. Then Mason saw the final thing. A scorched silver lighter lying beside the Harley frame. Engraved initials, VH. The second personal item Victor had left behind. Not arrogance, habit. He had been here the night Mason's father died. Personally. Mason picked up the lighter. His hand didn't shake. That was the dangerous part, because now revenge had transformed into certainty. Victor Hayes didn't just assault Walter, he murdered Mason's father, and under this mountain lay enough evidence to erase his empire in one move. Behind them, lightning flashed across the chamber entrance. The storm had reached the ridge, and somewhere below in the valley, Victor Hayes still believed he was waiting for county records to finish the takeover. He had no idea Mason was already standing in the room where his entire empire was born, and where it was about to die. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The storm growled outside the chamber mouth, lightning flashing through the tunnel in cold white bursts that made the scorched Harley frame look almost alive. Mason stood over what remained of his father's bike. The eagle engraving on the fork caught the flashlight beam, burned, warped, but still there. Proof that the official story had been a lie for 22 years. No canyon accident, no storm explosion. His father died in this chamber because he found what Victor Hayes was hiding. Smuggling routes, fuel laundering, political payoffs, the foundation of Hayes's entire empire. Reaper slowly closed the ledger crate. "This is federal-level dirt." "Good," Mason said. His voice came out flat, controlled, the kind of calm that made every brother in the room understand the line had been crossed. No more assumptions, no more suspicions. This was blood evidence. Jax moved toward the chamber shelves, scanning the rows of metal cases. Then why did Walter keep this hidden all these years? That was the question clawing at Mason too. Why bury the truth? Why protect the tunnel instead of exposing Hayes decades ago? His flashlight drifted across the far wall. Something had been mounted there once, a plaque maybe. Only 4 screws remained. Below it, fresh scrape marks, recent. Victor's men had already taken something from this chamber, not the ledgers, not the bike, something smaller, something specific. Hollow crouched beside the scrape line. Dragged out in the last 48 hours. Mason turned to the nearest shelf. One empty steel case, military lockbox style, forced open. Inside the foam cutout, only one shape was visible. A rectangular data drive, no bigger than a phone. Missing. Victor Hayes wasn't after land. He was after whatever digital proof Walter had stored here. Modern evidence. Probably every transfer, payoff, and bribe moved into digital archives. The ledgers were history. The drive was the present empire. And Victor had it. Reaper's eyes narrowed. Then tonight's assault on Walter wasn't the first move. No, Mason said. It was cleanup. Victor had come for the deed and to confirm whether Walter had told anyone else about the tunnel. When Walter survived, Victor accelerated. County transfer, sheriff protection, legal ownership. By sunrise, Hayes Development would move heavy equipment onto Creedland, straight to the ridge, straight to this chamber, to erase everything. Mason checked his watch. 4:42 a.m. Less than 3 hours before county offices opened, less than 4 before construction crews rolled. No time for the law, not yet. This needed to hit bigger, harder, cleaner. He grabbed the shipping ledgers and handed them to Reaper. "You ride these to Vegas." Reaper looked up sharply. "A TF?" A TF, IRS, federal transport crimes, anybody who hates money laundering. Jax grinned darkly. Which is basically all of them. Mason turned to Hollow. You and Jax get to the county recorder before opening. Freeze any land transfer tied to Creed property. With what authority? Mason pulled the original deed from inside his vest. The inheritance clause glinted under the flashlight. With this. Now they had leverage. The real deed. The tunnel evidence, the burned Harley, and Victor's personal lighter. Enough to stall, enough to pressure, enough to make Hayes panic. And panic was where rich men made mistakes. But then Mason's phone buzzed. One message, unknown number, a photo attachment. His blood went cold the second it loaded. Walter, hospital bed. IV ripped out, a gloved hand gripping the old man's shoulder. The text beneath it was simple. Trade the tunnel for his life. Sunrise, Creed garage. Come alone. For half a second, the chamber disappeared. All Mason saw was Walter's terrified face. Victor moved faster than expected. He must have had hospital staff bought, or Sheriff Pierce made the extraction himself. Either way, Walter was no longer safe. The entire trap had just changed. Reaper stepped closer. What is it? Mason turned the phone. The room darkened instantly. Jax swore. Hollow's jaw flexed. They took him. Mason stared at Walter's face in the photo. Bruised, exhausted, still alive. That was intentional. Victor wanted leverage, not revenge. He needed something only Walter or Mason could provide, the missing drive, or access deeper into the ridge. There was still another layer. Walter had hidden more than land papers. Victor wouldn't risk kidnapping unless something bigger remained out of reach. Sunrise, Creed garage, a public emotional execution site. Victor wanted Mason unstable, wanted him charging and angry, wanted him alone. Good. That was exactly what Mason would let him think. He slid Victor's lighter into his pocket, picked up the burned eagle fork from his father's Harley, then looked at his brothers. Phase 2. Reaper's expression hardened. You sure? No. Mason's eyes turned to the tunnel entrance where dawn's first gray light was beginning to seep through the storm clouds. But he just made it personal in the one way he shouldn't have. He had touched Walter twice, and now the old man was bait. That made Victor Hayes dead already. He just didn't know which version of dead yet, legal, financial, or buried under the same ridge where he killed Mason's father. The brothers moved fast. Reaper left with the ledgers. Jax and Hollow took the original deed and rode for county records. Mason remained alone in the chamber for one final second. He looked at the burned Harley frame, at the scorched chamber, at the place where his father's life ended and Victor's empire began. Then he turned and walked out into the storm. By sunrise, he would stand in the same garage where Walter bled. Victor Hayes would think he was controlling the board, but Mason finally understood what Walter had been protecting. The tunnel wasn't the weapon, the missing drive was. And if Victor wanted the final piece badly enough to kidnap an old man from a hospital bed, then that drive contained the one secret powerful enough to destroy every man who ever stood beside him. Sunrise was coming fast. So was the reckoning. Sunrise broke over Creed Auto and Iron in streaks of bruised orange and steel gray. Rain still dripped from the bent metal awning. The shattered front windows glowed with the first light of morning. And in the middle of the gravel lot, Victor Hayes stood like he already owned the earth beneath his shoes. Black wool coat, polished boots, 2 black SUVs idling behind him. 6 men spread around the garage entrance, private security dressed like contractors, and beside the open bay door, Walter Creed, bound to an old mechanic's chair with extension cords, bruised, one eye swollen shut, but alive. That was all Mason needed to see. He rolled into the lot alone, exactly as ordered. His Harley's engine thundered across the gravel, then fell into silence. Victor smiled, the same cold, practiced smile from the photograph in 1982. Only now it wore wealth instead of grease. You came. Mason climbed off the bike slowly, his face empty. No visible rage, no panic, just the stillness Victor had mistaken for surrender. You touched my grandfather again. Victor glanced toward Walter like he was discussing damaged property. He forced my hand. Walter lifted his head with visible effort. Mason, don't. The old man's voice cracked. Not fear, warning. Good. Walter had seen something Victor didn't. Mason was calm, too calm. Victor stepped closer. The drive. Straight to it. No pretense, no legal talk, no fake sympathy, just obsession. Mason's hand slid into his vest. Victor's men tensed instantly. Then, Mason pulled out only Victor's silver lighter, the scorched one from the tunnel. Victor's smile vanished. For the first time, real emotion crossed his face. Recognition. And beneath it, fear. So the lighter mattered. More than sentiment, more than guilt. It tied him physically to the chamber on the night Mason's father died. Mason turned it in his fingers. You were there when my father burned. Victor's jaw tightened. That was a long time ago. Not denial. Confirmation. Walter closed his eyes. Like the last hidden truth had finally been dragged into daylight. Mason took one slow step forward. You killed him. Victor exhaled through his nose. No, your father killed himself the second he decided to open crates that didn't belong to him. There it was. The confession hidden inside arrogance. His men shifted uneasily. Even they hadn't expected Victor to say it out loud. Mason's pulse slowed even further, because every second Victor kept talking made the trap tighter. You used Creed Ridge to move military fuel and cash through county lines, Mason said. My father found it. Victor shrugged. Your father was loyal right up until he wasn't. Walter's head snapped up. Loyal. That word hit the air like shrapnel. Mason saw it instantly. His father had once worked with Victor, just like the old photo. Partners, brothers, until betrayal. Walter's voice came raw through the morning air. Your father wanted to shut it down. Victor laughed softly. He wanted to take it. That was the lie. Mason heard it. Walter heard it too, because the old man's face twisted with disgust. You lying bastard. Victor's eyes cut to Walter. Careful, old man. And in that exact second, the sound hit. Helicopters, low, fast, closing. Victor's men looked up. So did the security teams near the SUVs. 2 black federal birds came over the ridgeline and dropped toward the bypass route. A TF Federal Transport Enforcement. Reaper had made it. Victor turned sharply toward Mason. You set me up. Mason's voice stayed almost gentle. No, you set yourself up the moment you kidnapped a hospital patient and confessed to murder on private property. Victor's expression changed from confidence to calculation. He reached for Walter. Human shield. Predictable. But before his hand touched the chair, a rifle crack shattered the morning. One of the SUV tires exploded. Then, the second. Jax and Hollow emerged from the construction ridge above the lot, county records papers in hand, and behind them, 2 sheriff cruisers, not Pierce's, state investigators. The land transfer had been frozen. Pierce was no longer the only badge in town. Victor's security men broke first, hands up, backpedaling. Nobody wanted federal smuggling and kidnapping charges tied to their payroll records. Walter sagged in the chair, exhausted. Victor's face hardened into something feral. He lunged for Mason, fast, too fast for a rich man his age, years of buried violence still alive in muscle memory. But Mason had been waiting for exactly this. Victor swung once. Mason slipped inside the punch and drove his fist into Victor's ribs with brutal precision. One shot, Victor folded, air gone. Before he hit the ground, Mason caught his coat collar and dragged him toward the garage threshold, toward the same blood-stained concrete where Walter had lain 12 hours earlier. You built your empire on my family's grave, Mason said quietly. Victor spat blood. And I'll still own this town. Mason's eyes lifted to the ridge. Federal agents were already flooding the bypass site. Construction halted, equipment seized, state police surrounding Pierce's office downtown. No, Mason said. Today you lose everything. Walter watched through one swollen eye as Mason cut the cords binding him. The old man's hands trembled, but his voice was steady. There's another drive. Mason froze. Victor's head snapped up. So Walter had kept the real final card hidden, not in the tunnel, not in the chamber, somewhere else. Victor's entire body went tense, animal panic. That told Mason everything. The drive Victor stole wasn't the kill shot. It was only half the evidence. Walter gripped Mason's wrist. Garage lift, Bay 3! Victor roared and tried to rise. Mason dropped him back to the gravel with one clean elbow across the jaw. Unconscious, done. Sirens, rotor blades, shouting agents, the empire collapsing in real time, but Walter's whisper changed the entire endgame. There was still one more secret under Creed Auto and Iron. One Walter had protected for 22 years, the evidence Victor had never found. The one thing powerful enough to erase not just his business, but every politician, sheriff, and corporate ghost tied to the Ridge. And it was hidden beneath Bay 3, inside the same garage where this war began. The federal helicopters still thundered overhead when Mason and Walter stepped back into the ruined garage. Morning light spilled through the shattered windows in long, pale bars, catching broken glass, scattered tools, and the dark stains of dried blood still spread across the concrete. Outside, Victor Hayes's empire was collapsing. Agents were swarming the bypass site. State investigators had Pierce in cuffs downtown. The SUVs were being searched, phones seized, contracts pulled, but Mason barely heard any of it now, because Walter's voice had changed, no longer weak, no longer frightened, just tired. The tiredness of a man who had carried the same secret for 22 years. Bay 3, Walter repeated. Mason moved fast. The third service bay still held the old hydraulic lift Walter had installed in 1989. Heavy steel, manual override system, industrial bolts sunk into reinforced concrete, the same lift Mason had worked under as a kid, passing sockets to his grandfather while pretending to understand engine blocks. Walter pointed with a shaking hand. Control panel, inside the side housing. Hollow and Jax had already entered through the broken side door, boots crunching over debris. Jax knelt beside the control box and pried open the steel panel with a flathead. Inside, another Creed lock, mechanical, old school, no electronics, no chance of remote wipe. Walter almost smiled through the bruising. Never trusted digital. Mason grabbed the crank wheel, the same family lock logic. Right, left, half, pull. The hydraulic lift groaned, but instead of rising, the entire concrete slab beneath Bay 3 split down the middle. A hidden floor hatch, dust and old oil drifted upward as the slab slowly separated, revealing a steel compartment built into the garage foundation. Victor Hayes had searched the office, the tunnel, the ridge. He never realized the final kill shot had been sitting under the garage floor the entire time. Walter looked at the opening with haunted eyes. This is what your father died protecting. Inside the compartment sat a single black lockbox. No military markings, no company labels, just one silver plaque. Robert Creed. If anything happens to me. Mason went completely still. His father had left this, not Walter, not after the fire. Before it, insurance, a dead man's final contingency. His hands tightened as he lifted the box onto the workbench. Heavy, paper and metal inside. Jack stepped closer. Open it, Mason used Walter's shop key ring. The third brass key fit. The lock clicked. Inside were 3 layers. First, original signed smuggling contracts between Robert Creed and Victor Hayes, proving they started the fuel route together. Second, a stack of photographs, politicians, judges, sheriffs, even Nolan Pierce 20 years younger, all standing in the ridge chamber beside military fuel drums. Every face that helped build Hayes's network, every ghost still feeding from it, and beneath all of it, a VHS tape, labeled in Robert's handwriting, "The night Victor tried to kill me." Nobody in the garage moved. Even Hollow went silent. Walter closed his eyes, like he had waited decades for this exact moment. Mason stared at the tape. His father knew. He knew Victor would come for him, and he recorded it. This wasn't just evidence. This was legacy. Truth from the dead. Walter sank into the mechanic's stool beside the bench, his breathing rough. "I told your father to run that night." Mason turned. Walter's face looked older than it had even in the hospital. "Victor changed after the military contracts," Walter said quietly. "At first it was just fuel diversion, black market surplus, easy money. Your father hated it, but we were broke after the mine collapse. Then Victor started using the route for politicians. Cash, bribes, property blackmail. He wanted the whole county." Walter swallowed hard. "Your father said he was done, said he'd expose everyone. That tape, he recorded the meeting in the ridge chamber before confronting Victor." Mason looked at the VHS like it was radioactive. The confession. The attempted murder. Maybe the exact moment everything burned. Jax already understood. "We need a player." Walter nodded toward the old lounge corner. "The VCR still works. I never threw it out." Of course he hadn't. Walter never threw away anything that mattered. Hollow plugged the old TV in while Jax fed the VHS into the machine. The tape whirred, static, then image. The Ridge Chamber, June 14th, 2002. His father alive. Leather jacket, standing beside the Harley. Young Victor Hayes across from him, suit already replacing grease, and Robert's voice cut through the static. "This ends tonight, Victor." The garage went dead silent. On screen, Victor laughed. "You think one tape changes anything?" Robert stepped closer. "It changes prison sentences." Then, shouting, movement, a gun. Walter flinched beside Mason, because now they were all watching the exact second history broke. Victor pulled the gun first. Robert lunged. The tape shook violently. Fuel drums toppled. Sparks. Then Victor's voice screaming, "If I burn, you burn with me." The screen erupted in white fire, tape distortion, smoke, and in the final clear frame before static swallowed everything, Victor Hayes ran from the chamber alone, leaving Robert behind, leaving him to die. The TV hissed into silence. Walter bowed his head. The truth was finally out. No theory, no suspicion. Cold murder caught on tape. Mason stood there staring at the black screen. His father's last living image, his final words, his betrayal. And now Victor Hayes's fate had changed. This was no longer smuggling, no longer land fraud. This was first-degree murder with recorded evidence, enough to bury every survivor tied to the Ridge. Outside, federal agents were moving toward the garage, but Mason's eyes stayed on the tape, because Robert's first line kept echoing. "This ends tonight." 22 years later, it finally would. The garage doors burst open before the tape had fully stopped spinning. Federal agents poured in first. Dark windbreakers. A TF, state investigators right behind them, and in the middle of them all, Victor Hayes, hands cuffed behind his back, lips split, one eye already swelling where Mason had dropped him outside. But the second Victor saw the VHS still resting in the VCR tray. Something primal broke across his face. Not anger, not pride, terror, real terror. He lunged. 3 agents slammed him face first into Walter's old workbench, the same bench where Robert Creed had rebuilt engines, the same bench where Mason had just watched his father die on tape. Victor snarled through blood. "You don't know what that tape means." Mason stepped forward slowly. "I know exactly what it means." He picked up the VHS, held it where Victor could see the label. "The night Victor tried to kill me." The room had gone silent. Even the agents were listening now, because this wasn't just evidence anymore. It was history resurfacing. A murder from 22 years ago walking back into daylight. Walter rose shakily from the stool. Every bruise on his face now looked less like pain and more like unfinished time. "He left my son to burn." Victor's jaw clenched. "Your son chose his side." Walter's voice cracked like a rifle shot. "He chose what was right." That line hung in the garage like judgment. The agents moved Victor toward the door. Then, one of the state investigators stepped inside holding another evidence bag, a silver laptop, cracked casing, recovered from Victor's SUV. The missing drive had already been copied into it. The agent nodded to Mason. "We got the digital archive." That changed everything. Now they had tunnel ledgers, land fraud records, the real deed political payoff photos, the murder tape, the digital archive. Victor kidnapped Walter. For no empire survived that. No sheriff, no judge, no mayor, nobody. Victor finally understood it too. The mask came off completely. "You think they'll let this go public?" His voice had dropped, quiet, cold, threatening, not toward Mason. Toward the room, toward the law itself. The investigator looked him dead in the eye. "Federal RICO doesn't ask permission." Victor's face emptied. For the first time in his life, he had reached the wall. Money couldn't move. He was dragged outside. But before he disappeared through the bay door, he twisted toward Walter, toward the old man he thought he had broken. "This town dies with me." Walter answered before Mason could. "No." His bruised hand rested on the hidden hatch beneath Bay 3. "Your version of it does." Outside, the lot had transformed into a war zone of law. Tow trucks, seized black SUVs, construction foremen from Hayes Development being lined up and questioned, state auditors carrying boxes from the county clerk's office, the bypass project already frozen, news vans arriving. The story was exploding in real time. Jack stepped in from the lot holding his phone. "You need to see this." He turned the screen. Local news live stream. Sheriff Nolan Pierce arrested in widespread development corruption case. Then another banner. Bypass land fraud under federal investigation, and below it, Victor Hayes' face, public, destroyed. Mason stared at the screen for 1 second, then turned back toward Walter. The old man was sitting again, not from weakness, from release, like the weight of 22 years had finally lifted off his shoulders. Mason walked over, set the VHS on the bench between them. Walter touched the label with grease-stained fingers. "Your father always knew Victor would turn." "Why didn't he release this?" Walter's eyes stayed on the tape. "Because he still thought he could save him." That landed harder than the fire itself. Robert Creed died trying to save a brother who had already sold his soul. Mason looked around the garage, the shattered windows, the broken office, the bloodstains, the hidden hatch under Bay 3. And for the first time since riding back into town, he could finally see the future beyond revenge. Not destruction. Restoration. The Creed name no longer had to live buried under the ridge. Now it could live above ground again. A federal agent approached with paperwork. "Mr. Creed, the original deed and inheritance clause are valid. Hayes Development's claim is void. Creed Auto and Iron is fully restored to family ownership." Walter closed his eyes. A single breath left him, half grief, half peace. The garage was theirs again, not legally pending, not temporarily. Theirs. Outside, the storm clouds had finally broken. Sunlight cut through the shattered windows and spilled across Robert's old workbench, the VHS tape, and the black lockbox. Walter looked at Mason, his voice quieter now. "There's one last thing your father left you." Mason frowned. Walter pointed toward the old Harley frame part stacked in the back corner, covered in a tarp Mason hadn't noticed before. The second bike. Mason's pulse slowed. His father's backup Harley, the one he had been rebuilding before the fire. Walter almost smiled despite the swelling. He wanted you to finish it one day. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about Victor Hayes dying in chains. It was about legacy surviving fire, blood surviving betrayal, a family name rebuilt from steel. Mason looked at the tarp-covered frame, then at Walter, then at the garage. And he understood. The war for the land was over. Now came the harder part, bringing the Creed bloodline back to life. By noon, the garage no longer looked like a crime scene. It looked like resurrection. Sunlight poured through the broken front windows in warm white beams, catching floating dust and the shine of chrome tools Hollow had already begun setting back in place. Outside, federal tow rigs hauled away Hayes Development vehicles one by one. The bypass project cranes in the valley stood frozen, dead, like steel monuments to a fallen empire. Inside, Walter sat in his old mechanic's chair with his arms strapped and ribs bandaged, refusing every suggestion of rest. Mason knew that look. The old man wasn't running on strength, he was running on unfinished purpose. "The tarp," Walter said. Mason crossed the shop toward the far rear bay. The corner had always been off limits when he was a kid. Walter used to call it future iron. At the time, Mason thought it was just old scrap. Now, he knew better. He pulled the tarp back, and for a moment, the whole world narrowed. A Harley frame stood on the stand beneath it, black, hand-striped silver flames, a custom Eagle tank badge wrapped in cloth, half-finished, his father's second bike, Robert Creed's final build. Mason stepped closer. The chrome still held fingerprints under the dust, not random shop grease. His father's touch frozen in time. Walter's voice came from behind him. "He started it 3 weeks before the fire." Mason ran his hand over the tank. The steel was cold, but the moment hit like heat. He remembered being 10 years old, sitting on the tool chest while Robert held the same tank up to the light. "One day this one's yours, kid." Mason had forgotten the words. The bike had remembered them. Jax whistled low. "Beautiful machine." Walter gave the smallest nod. Fastest thing Robert ever built. Then his expression darkened. Victor wanted that bike too. Mason turned. What? Walter pointed to the empty rear rack. Under the seat pan. Mason moved fast. The rear fender was only dry-fitted. He lifted it free. Underneath sat a sealed leather pouch bolted into the frame cavity, hidden, protected, another dead man contingency. Inside the pouch, a folded letter, Robert's handwriting, addressed simply, "For Mason, when you're ready." The garage disappeared around him. No federal agents, no broken glass, no storm aftermath, just his father's words in his hands. His fingers tightened around the letter for one long second before he opened it. The paper had yellowed, but the ink remained sharp. Mason, if you're reading this, then Victor finally became the man I was afraid he'd become. I kept this bike unfinished because I wanted you to earn the last piece yourself, not with anger, not with revenge, with discipline. Steel only holds together under the right pressure. Men are the same. If Victor burns everything, rebuild it stronger. Don't become him. Under the tank bracket is the final part, the one he never knew existed. Finish the bike, finish the creed name. Dad. For the first time since returning to town, Mason felt something cut through the rage. Not grief, not revenge. Guidance. His father had been speaking across 22 years, not telling him to destroy, telling him what came after. Walter nodded toward the front neck bracket. Mason crouched beside the frame. There, hidden behind the unfinished tank mount, a slim titanium cylinder. He unscrewed it. Inside was a microfilm strip, old school, undetectable, impossible to hack. Hollow leaned over. "What is that?" Walter answered before Mason could. "The offshore account chain." The room went still. Walter exhaled slowly. Robert kept proof of every account Victor ever used to move money overseas. Politicians, judges, shell companies, all of it. Even after the VHS, even after the digital archive, Robert had still built a final nuclear option into the bike itself, because he knew Victor would never stop chasing the loose ends. And now, Mason held the only surviving original, the permanent kill shot. Outside, black SUVs from federal financial crimes rolled into the lot. Perfect timing. Victor Hayes's empire wasn't just collapsing. It was about to become unrecoverable. Mason slid the microfilm into his vest pocket, then looked back at the unfinished Harley. The chrome forks, the Eagle tank, the empty engine cradle still waiting for its heart. His father's final request echoed louder than the revenge. "Finish the bike." Walter looked at him with tired but steady eyes. Robert didn't want the creed name remembered for what Victor did. Mason nodded slowly. He wanted it remembered for what we built. Walter smiled for the first time. A real smile. Small. Broken. But real. "Now you understand." Outside, news helicopters circled the bypass scandal. Inside, the true final chapter was beginning. Not courts, not prison, not land records. Legacy. Mason rolled the bike frame into the center bay where sunlight hit the steel. He laid his father's letter on the workbench beside the VHS, then picked up the first wrench, the same size Robert always used for primary mounts. The sound of metal meeting metal rang through Creed auto and iron, not like violence, like heartbeat. Victor Hayes had spent 22 years trying to bury the Creed bloodline. Instead, he had handed Mason the exact thing that would make it immortal. The land was saved. The empire had fallen. Now the real rebuild could begin. With steel. With blood. And with the unfinished Harley Robert Creed had left waiting for his son. By sunset, the sound of wrenches had replaced the sound of sirens. The chaos outside still continued. News vans lined Route 16. Federal agents moved in and out of Hayes development offices downtown. Tow trucks dragged seized construction equipment off the bypass site. But inside Creed auto and iron, time had shifted into something older, something sacred. The unfinished Harley stood in the center bay under the brightest shop light, its black frame now stripped clean and mounted true. Mason worked in silence. Primary housing first, then the transmission cradle, then the rebuilt knucklehead engine Walter had preserved in Cosmoline for 22 years. Every bolt felt less like repair and more like conversation. A son learning how to hear his father through steel. Walter sat nearby in his chair, arm in a sling, watching every move, not supervising, witnessing. The same way Robert once watched Mason tighten his first sprocket at age 11. "Too much torque," Walter muttered. Mason paused, looked at the rear mount. Walter was right. Half a turn too far. Mason eased it back. Walter's bruised mouth pulled into the faintest smile. "Your father always over-tightened that side too." For a second, all three generations were in the garage at once, the dead, the old, and the one left to carry both. Reaper returned just after dark. His boots tracked dust and federal paperwork across the shop floor. "It's done." Mason looked up from the engine mount. Reaper tossed a folded news bulletin onto the bench beside Robert's letter. "Federal RICO charges filed against Victor Hayes and 14 public officials below it. State freezes all Hayes development assets." Then the final line. "Offshore account trail confirmed through microfilm evidence." The microfilm had detonated exactly as Robert intended. Every hidden account, every shell company, every politician, gone, frozen, exposed. Walter stared at the article for a long moment, then exhaled like 22 years had finally left his lungs. Robert finished him from the grave. Mason looked back at the bike. "No, he handed me the wrench." The distinction mattered, because revenge had ended this morning. This was inheritance. Jax rolled in an old parts cart from the storage loft, wrapped in oilcloth. Walter's eyes narrowed instantly. "You kept that?" Jax grinned. "Figured the old man hid enough secrets already. Might as well check the attic." Inside the cloth lay the final missing piece. The custom gas tank. Black enamel. Silver eagle stretched across both sides, and beneath the wing, a small hand-painted line Mason hadn't seen since childhood. "Ride straight, burn clean, come home," his father's words. The same phrase Robert used every time Mason rode out as a teenager, every time he left angry, every time he swore he wasn't coming back. Walter's voice softened. "He painted that the week before the fire." Mason lifted the tank with both hands. For a second it felt heavier than steel, because this wasn't a machine anymore. It was every unfinished word between father and son. He set it onto the frame. Perfect fit. The Harley finally looked complete, not finished, but alive. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Nevada hills. The storm had passed completely. The whole town could probably hear the silence around the garage now. No cranes, no construction blasts, no Hayes convoys, only the old shop lights glowing into the dark. Hollow walked in carrying 2 folders. "One more thing." He set them on the workbench. "Legal documents. The first transferred full ownership of Creed Ridge and all mineral rights permanently into Mason's name. The second, a state grant. Historical preservation status. The Ridge Tunnel, garage, and Robert's chamber were now protected as evidence and family land. Nobody would ever touch it again. Not developers, not corporations, not politicians." Walter looked at Mason. "Your father wanted the shop to survive longer than men like Victor." Mason signed both papers. Slowly, deliberately. This time the Creed name wasn't being forged, it was being restored. Then Walter pointed to the ignition housing on the finished bike. "Go ahead." Mason's pulse slowed. He filled the fuel line, primed the carb. 1 kick, nothing. 2nd kick, a cough. Walter chuckled through bruised ribs. Again, 3rd kick. The Harley roared to life. The sound exploded through the garage like resurrection. Deep, violent, beautiful. Every man in the room went still, because for a second, it sounded exactly like Robert's bike pulling into the lot in summer 2001. Mason gripped the bars tighter. The vibration moved through his bones. Not rage, not revenge. Blood memory. Walter's eyes filled, though his voice stayed steady. "That's your father." Mason stared ahead through the shattered front windows into the Nevada night. The town beyond was changing. Victor Hayes' shadow was gone. The bypass stopped. The corruption exposed. But what mattered was right here. Creed Auto and Iron breathing again. And in the center bay, the Harley his father built for him finally alive beneath his hands. The war was over. The rebuild had begun. And tomorrow morning, for the first time in 22 years, Mason would ride the Creed name back through town in daylight. Not as a ghost. as the man who brought it home. Morning came clear and cold over Oak Ridge County. For the first time in years, the town woke without the sound of construction blasts from the bypass ridge. No cranes moving, no convoy trucks, no black SUVs from Hayes Development crawling through Main Street like they owned the place. Just sunlight, quiet, and the deep mechanical heartbeat rolling out of Creed Auto and Iron. The rebuilt Harley stood in the center bay, black paint gleaming under the morning light pouring through newly boarded windows. Mason ran a cloth over the tank one last time. The silver eagle spread across the metal looked almost alive. Under the wing, Robert's words caught the light. Ride straight, burn clean. Come home. Walter stood by the office doorway with his sling still strapped, stubborn as ever. You're really going to ride it through town? Mason looked up. That's the point. Walter's bruised face softened. For the first time since the assault, the old man no longer looked like a survivor. He looked like the owner of the shop again, the Creed patriarch, the man Victor Hayes had failed to erase. Outside, Reaper and the brothers were already lined up. 7 Harleys this time. Word had spread overnight through the Nevada and Arizona charters, not about revenge, about restoration, about one family line refusing to die. Mason wheeled Robert's Harley into the sunlight. Every brother in the lot went silent, because now the machine was complete. Not museum perfect, better, alive. Grease in the seams, fresh heat in the pipes, a son's fingerprints over a father's unfinished work. Reaper nodded once. Your old man would be proud. Mason swung a leg over the bike. The seat leather was still stiff from Walter's preserved stock. He gripped the bars. For 1 second, memory blurred with reality. His father's hands over his when he was 12. A bike doesn't care who rides it. It only cares if you respect the road. Mason kicked the starter. The Harley answered on the first roar. Louder than last night, stronger. The sound rolled across Route 16 and down into town like a declaration. Walter stepped forward slowly. His hand rested on the tank for half a second. Bring the Creed name back where people can see it. Mason gave one quiet nod. Then the line of Harleys rolled out. 7 bikes behind Robert's restored Eagle machine. The ride into town wasn't fast. It didn't need to be. Every storefront turned, every porch, every gas station, people came out to watch, not because of the patch, because everyone in Oak Ridge already knew. Victor Hayes was finished. Sheriff Pierce was in federal custody. The bypass fraud was national news, and the Creed garage still stood. Main Street fell silent as Mason led the ride through the center of town, past the diner Hayes once tried to buy, past the county records office where the forged transfer had died, past the courthouse steps now swarming with reporters. People stared at the Silver Eagle tank. Older faces recognized it instantly. Robert Creed's bike, the machine they thought burned with him, a ghost riding in daylight. At the courthouse intersection, the line slowed. Media vans, satellite dishes, state investigators escorting boxes of seized files down the front steps. And then Mason saw her. A woman in her early 40s standing on the courthouse lawn beside the federal media line. Dark hair tied back, brown leather jacket, eyes locked on Robert's Harley like she had seen it in another life. Walter's age in her cheekbones, Robert's eyes in the stare. She stepped forward as the bikes idled. Mason Creed? Her voice barely carried over the engines. Mason stopped. Something in the way she said his name hit wrong, too personal, too certain. He killed the engine. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Yes, the woman swallowed hard. My name is Elena Hayes. The surname landed like a punch. Victor Hayes. Every brother in the formation stiffened. Hands shifted closer to bars and belts. But the woman raised both palms. No, I'm not here for him. Her eyes moved to the Eagle tank, then back to Mason. My mother was Robert Creed's sister. The world narrowed. Walter had never mentioned a sister, never mentioned surviving family beyond him. The woman's voice trembled. I found out last night when the federal seizure team opened Victor's family archive. He changed our names after the fire, buried the Creed line under his own. Walter's old family secrets suddenly ran deeper than the Ridge Tunnel. Mason stepped off the Harley slowly. What are you saying? Elena pulled a folded birth record from her jacket. Official. Old county seal. Her mother's maiden name. Anna Creed, Robert's younger sister. Mason stared at the paper. Victor Hayes hadn't just stolen land. He had absorbed family blood into his own dynasty, married into the Creed line, buried it under wealth and corruption, and now one surviving branch had just walked back into daylight. Elena's eyes filled. I grew up hearing one story, that Robert died a criminal, that Walter sold the land, that the Creed name meant betrayal. She looked at the Harley. At sunrise today I saw the news. I saw Victor arrested, and I saw that bike. Her voice cracked. My mother lied to protect me, but before she died, she told me one thing. Mason said nothing. Elena looked directly at him. If the eagle ever rides again, go home. The entire street disappeared. The town, the reporters, the agents, the Harleys, all of it. Because suddenly the rebuild wasn't just about a shop. The Creed bloodline hadn't only survived through Mason. It had survived through a branch Victor Hayes thought he had swallowed into his empire, and now that branch had come back. On the courthouse lawn, in broad daylight, just as Robert's Harley returned to town. The ride through Oak Ridge had changed again. It was no longer a victory lap. It was the beginning of the Creed family returning from the dead. The courthouse lawn stayed silent long after Elena Hayes finished speaking. The news crews sensed something bigger than corruption charges now. Bigger than Victor Hayes in cuffs, a bloodline twist, a buried family branch returning the exact morning Robert Creed's Eagle Harley rode back through town. Cameras started shifting toward Mason, toward Elena, toward the silver Eagle tank still ticking with engine heat in the morning cold. Mason stared at the birth record in her hand. Anna Creed, his father's sister. A name Walter had never once spoken, not in childhood, not after the fire, not during the war with Victor, nothing. Walter had hidden more than tunnels and tapes. He had hidden family. Reaper leaned closer, voice low enough only Mason could hear. You trust her? Mason didn't answer immediately, because Elena wasn't looking at the cameras, wasn't looking at Victor's ruined courthouse steps. She was looking at the Harley, at Robert's bike, with the kind of grief you can't fake. That mattered. He turned the engine off completely and stepped closer. Where's your mother now? Elena's throat tightened. She died 3 years ago. The line hit harder than expected. Another Creed gone without ever coming home. Another branch buried under Victor's lies. She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out an old envelope. The paper was worn thin at the folds, oil stain in one corner, Walter's handwriting on the front. For Anna, only if Victor ever falls Mason's pulse slowed. Walter. So he had known, all along. He had prepared for this exact morning. Elena held out the letter with shaking fingers. My mother told me never to open it unless Victor Hayes's empire collapsed. Last night I saw the arrests. Mason took the envelope. Heavy. More paper inside. Maybe photographs. Maybe another confession. Maybe the reason Walter buried Anna Creed from the family tree. He looked toward the garage road in the distance. Walter was waiting. And suddenly, the need to confront the old man became stronger than the media storm around them. We're going back, Mason said. Elena nodded without hesitation, like she had already decided this road the moment she saw the Eagle tank. The ride back to Creed Auto and Iron felt different. Not triumph, not vengeance, unearthing. The Harleys rolled slower now, the courthouse chaos fading behind them. Elena rode in Hollow's truck behind the bikes, clutching the satchel in her lap like it held the only surviving bridge between dead generations. When the garage finally came into view, Walter was already standing in the doorway, one arm in a sling, body bruised, but posture straight, waiting. The second he saw Elena step from the truck, the color drained from his face. For a long moment, nobody moved. The shop lights hummed softly behind him, dust drifted in the morning sun. The rebuilt Harley clicked as it cooled beside Mason, and Walter whispered the name like a ghost had answered him. Anna. Elena's eyes filled immediately. I'm her daughter. Walter shut his eyes. The old man who survived beatings, tunnels, murder tapes, and federal raids almost staggered from the force of memory alone. Mason stepped forward and handed him the envelope. You knew. Walter looked at the handwriting on the front and nodded once, slow, heavy. Yes. No denial, no deflection, just truth. Mason's voice stayed calm, too calm. Then start talking. Walter lowered himself into the mechanic's chair, like the weight of 40 years had finally caught up. His eyes never left Elena. After Robert died, Victor came to Anna, told her the Creed name was poison now. Told her anyone carrying it would be hunted by the same men who burned the ridge. Elena's breathing sharpened. My mother said he saved her. Walter gave a bitter laugh. He didn't save her. He absorbed her, married her into the Hayes family trust, changed the records, buried her maiden name under shell inheritances and political protections. Mason felt the pieces locked together. Victor didn't just want land, he wanted legitimacy. Creed blood gave him historic mineral claims through Anna's branch. That was how Hayes' development expanded so fast. He had fused his empire to the Creed line. Elena sat down hard on the stool opposite Walter. So my whole life, Walter nodded, was built on stolen blood. Silence swallowed the garage. Then Walter took the envelope, opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a folded map fragment, old parchment matching the ridge survey from the tunnel. But this one showed something new, a lower chamber beneath the burned one, a second hidden vault. Walter's voice dropped. Robert split the evidence. Mason's eyes narrowed. The tunnel chamber was only the first archive. Walter looked at Elena. The second vault was meant for Anna. If Victor ever turned on the family completely, she was supposed to use it. Elena stared at the map like her mother's voice had just spoken through the paper. What's in it? Walter's bruised jaw tightened. The inheritance ledger. Even Reaper went still. Walter continued. Every land deed Victor stole through marriage, fraud, blackmail, and falsified bloodline transfers. Every family property folded into Hayes' development. That changed everything. This was bigger than Creed Auto, bigger than the bypass. Victor Hayes hadn't just built a corrupt company. He had built a bloodline empire by marrying, coercing, and erasing family names, farms, garages, mineral rights, historic ranches, whole generational legacies. And somewhere under Creed Ridge sat the master ledger that could return them all. Elena looked up at Mason. What happens if we find it? Mason's eyes moved to Robert's Harley, to Walter, to the ridgeline beyond the broken shop windows, then back to Elena. We don't just rebuild Creed. His voice dropped lower, deadlier. We collapse every stolen inheritance Victor ever touched. The garage air changed. The war had evolved again. This was no longer one family reclaiming one shop. This was the beginning of a county-wide bloodline restoration. And the map fragment in Walter's hands pointed to a vault Victor Hayes never found, a deeper chamber beneath the ridge, one final grave of truth. And this time, Mason wouldn't be going there alone. The lost Creed branch was coming with him. They moved before nightfall. No one wanted to give the county time to breathe, because by now the news had already spread beyond Oak Ridge. Victor Hayes' arrest had cracked open decades of sealed claims. Families were calling lawyers. Old ranch owners were digging through attic boxes. Widows were comparing forged signatures. The entire county had begun to realize the same terrifying thing. Their names may not legally belong to them. And somewhere under Creed Ridge sat the master ledger that could give them everything back. The lost inheritance vault. The final chamber. Mason strapped the new map fragment beside the original ridge survey inside his vest. 2 halves, 1 path. Elena stood beside Robert's restored Harley, staring at the Silver Eagle tank. For the first time since arriving, she reached out and touched it. Her fingers froze over the painted wing. My mother used to sketch this symbol, she whispered. She said it came from a dream she couldn't explain. Walter gave a tired nod. It wasn't a dream. She grew up watching Robert paint it. Elena's eyes filled. More stolen memory returning. Mason looked toward the ridge. Then let's bring the rest home. This ride felt different from every other. No war formation, no intimidation, just purpose. Mason on Robert's Harley, Reaper behind him, Jackson Hollow carrying excavation gear, and Elena riding in the truck with Walter, who refused to stay behind despite the bruised ribs and doctor's orders. This ends with my family present, the old man said. Nobody argued. By dusk, they reached the ridge gate again. The first tunnel chamber still stood open, federal evidence tape now hanging loose in the cold wind. The burned Harley frame remained under state lock in the upper chamber, but the new map fragment pointed below it, a maintenance shaft hidden behind the collapsed left passage, the side they originally dismissed as dead rock. Mason studied the combined map under flashlight. "The collapse is fake," Hollow grinned. "Of course it is." Walter stepped closer, breathing harder from the climb. "Robert built false cave-ins when we ran surplus storage in the mine years before Victor. The old mechanic still had secrets layered inside secrets." Jax moved to the rubble wall, fresh enough to be artificial. Old support beams deliberately snapped and stacked, a deception built by family hands. Together they pulled the false collapse apart, stone by stone, timber by timber, until a narrow iron ladder shaft emerged behind it, descending into blackness. Cold air rose from below, dry, still, untouched. Elena stared into the darkness. "My mother never knew this existed." Walter's voice softened. "She was never meant to carry this alone." Mason went first, flashlight in one hand, father's silver wrench in the other. The ladder dropped 30 feet into a circular vault chamber carved from natural stone. Unlike the smuggling room above, this place was untouched by fire, pristine, sacred. Steel cabinets lined the walls, locked deed tubes stacked in cedar shelves, family crests painted on labeled boxes, Creed, Benson, Marlowe, Hastings, dozens of old county names, not just their family, half the original landowning bloodlines of Oak Ridge County. Victor Hayes had stolen from everyone. Walter stepped off the ladder and nearly stopped breathing. "Robert actually did it." Elena slowly turned in place. "This is a restoration archive." "Exactly. Not blackmail, not smuggling." Robert had built the chamber as a return vault, a place where the original inheritance chain could survive, even if Victor corrupted every courthouse above ground. Mason moved to the central table. One ledger lay alone under glass, larger than anything else in the room, leather blackened with age, silver stamped title, Oak Ridge Bloodline Inheritance, Master Ledger. The kill shot, the document Victor never found. Elena lifted the glass cover. Inside the first page were names, every original family line in the county. Beside each one, original ownership, fraudulent Hayes acquisition date, forged marriage chain, political witness signatures, rightful surviving heirs. Jax stared at the list. "This could reverse half the county." Walter corrected him. "All of it." Then Mason's flashlight hit something else on the final page, a sealed envelope, smaller, addressed in Robert's handwriting, for Mason and Anna's bloodline. Together, Mason and Elena exchanged one look. Robert had predicted this too. The surviving branches reunited. Only then should the final message be opened. Elena's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, a handwritten trust release. Robert had transferred all restored Creed mineral rights, the garage, Ridgeland, and future trust authority jointly to Mason and Anna Creed's surviving heir. To Elena. Victor Hayes had spent decades trying to consume the Creed line through marriage. Instead, Robert built a legal failsafe that would restore both branches the moment they reunited. Walter sat heavily on the stone bench, emotion finally overtaking the old iron in him. He knew family would find its way back. Elena's tears finally fell. Not grief, recognition. Her mother's lost name had just been legally resurrected. But the final page held one more revelation. A red-marked section titled, "Active Hayes Holdings, Still Occupied by Fraud." 3 properties remained under live Hayes shell control, despite the federal seizure. One of them froze Mason instantly. St. Mercy Children's Home. Elena's breath caught. "That's where my mother volunteered." Walter's bruised face darkened. "No." Mason looked up. Walter's voice turned deadly quiet. "That isn't a children's home anymore." The chamber air changed. Walter pointed to the ledger notation beside the property. "Used for lineage document processing and identity restructuring." Elena went pale. Victor Hayes had been using the orphanage to rewrite bloodlines, adoptions, birth certificates, inheritance identities, for years. Not just land theft, human lineage laundering. Children folded into family trusts and erased into corporate heir structures. The final surviving Hayes operation wasn't a building. It was a living machine still rewriting names. And now the ledger had exposed it. Mason closed the master book slowly. The sound echoed through the vault like a verdict. The county rebuild wasn't over. Victor's empire still had one breathing arm left, and it was hiding behind the most untouchable mask possible: a children's home. The final war had just changed shape again. Now it wasn't about restoring the dead. It was about saving the living heirs Victor Hayes was still erasing. They left the vault in silence, not because there was nothing to say, because everyone understood the shape of what came next. Victor Hayes had spent decades stealing land, names, marriages, and bloodlines. But St. Mercy Children's Home was different. This wasn't dead paperwork. This was a machine still running, still changing names, still burying heirs in real time. By the time they rode back down from Creed Ridge, night had fallen over Oak Ridge County. The town glowed in scattered porch lights and flashing media vans near the courthouse. News of the federal seizures had already turned the county upside down. But the real poison was still alive, and it was hidden behind a charity sign. Inside the garage, Mason spread the master ledger open on Walter's workbench. The St. Mercy entry sat circled in Robert's red ink, used for lineage document processing and identity restructuring. Elena stared at the page. My mother volunteered there every Christmas. Walter's jaw tightened. That's why Victor kept it untouched. Nobody questions a children's home. Reaper leaned over the ledger. There's an address history. He pointed to a note in the margin. Sub-basement archive. Restricted donor wing access. Mason immediately understood. Just like the Ridge. Victor layered truth beneath respectable facades, tunnel under land, vault under tunnel, archive under orphanage, always one floor deeper. Jax looked toward the garage door. You want law on this? Mason's eyes stayed on the ledger. No. Everyone looked at him. He finally lifted his head. Not until we know if kids are still inside. That changed the room. Because now this wasn't evidence recovery. This was extraction. If St. Mercy was still running active identity laundering, there could be minors whose names had already been reassigned into dormant Hayes trusts, future inheritors, human legal assets, the kind of crime so cold it barely felt real. Elena stepped closer to the bench. There was always one wing they kept locked. My mother called it the donor records office. Walter gave a bitter nod. Victor never called it records. Mason looked at him. Walter's face hardened. He called it legacy intake. The words hit like ice. Not just random children, specific bloodlines, orphans from wealthy families, disaster heirs, custody disputes, any child whose inheritance could be rerouted. Victor wasn't only stealing from the dead, he was harvesting the future. Mason closed the ledger. Enough. No more waiting. They moved out within minutes. No patched convoy this time. No roar of Harleys. Stealth, one truck, lights off, back roads only. St. Mercy sat 12 miles east near the old county line, surrounded by pine trees and a wrought iron fence built to look charitable in daylight and prison-like at night. The white chapel roof glowed under moonlight, cross on top, children's murals on the outer walls, every visual designed to disarm suspicion. Mason parked beyond the tree line. The building looked quiet. Too quiet. No visible security. No night staff moving between wings. That alone screamed trap. Elena pointed through the trees. South wing. Basement stairs are under the donation office. Walter stayed in the truck, every instinct in him screaming to go in, but his body finally losing the argument. Bring the names back, he said quietly. Mason gave one nod, then moved. Hollow cut the side chain gate without a sound. Jax jammed the donation office lock in seconds. Inside, the hallway smelled of bleach, old paper, and something sterile beneath the sweetness of donated toys. The walls were lined with children's drawings, sunflowers, houses, family trees. Mason's jaw tightened at that last one. Even here, Victor had hidden the cruelty in plain sight. The donation office sat empty. A mahogany desk, charity plaques, photos of Victor Hayes smiling beside foster children, the perfect public mask. Elena crossed straight to the rear bookshelf. Her hand pressed a brass angel statue. The shelf clicked, rotated inward. A hidden staircase. Of course, always another layer. The basement below was colder. Concrete walls, archive shelving, fluorescent lights still humming. But what filled the room froze every one of them. Rows of metal filing cabinets, each drawer labeled by surname. Not children's names, Family names: Benson, Marlowe, Creed, Hayes, dozens, hundreds, bloodlines converted into filing systems. Jax yanked open the nearest drawer: birth certificates, adoption transfers, probate amendments, name replacement orders, trust redirections. Children moved like chess pieces through legal identities. Elena's voice trembled. This is where they erased us. Then Mason heard it. A soft sound, not paper, not ventilation, a child crying, faint, behind the archive wall. He moved instantly. Flashlight beam cut across the far cabinets. There, a reinforced steel door marked Donor Restricted / Legacy Holding. Rage surged cold through him. Victor hadn't just been laundering documents. He was still holding children tied to active inheritance disputes, living heirs waiting to be reassigned. Hollow forced the lock with a pry bar. The steel door opened, and behind it, 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, no older than 10, blankets, cots, a TV, no windows, a holding room disguised as a medical observation suite. The girl looked up first, eyes wide, fear mixed with hope. "Are you with Mr. Hayes?" Mason crouched slowly, his voice gentler than anything the room had heard tonight. "No." The little boy clutched a stuffed eagle toy, silver-stitched wings, Creed symbol. Mason's pulse slowed. This was deliberate. Victor had been collecting heirs tied to the same families listed in Robert's ledger. The children weren't random. They were the final living pieces of the stolen inheritance machine. Elena stepped into the room and froze. The oldest boy held an intake bracelet, surname printed across it, Creed. The world narrowed. Elena's voice cracked. "That's Anna's grandson." Walter's bloodline hadn't just survived through Elena. Victor had been secretly holding the youngest surviving Creed heir inside St. Mercy, a living child branch Victor planned to use for future trust control. The final breathing hostage of the Creed empire. Mason lifted the boy gently into his arms. The child stared at the silver eagle patch on Mason's cut. "My grandma said if the eagle came back, we'd go home." The exact same words Anna gave Elena. The family signal. Passed down across generations. Robert planned for blood to recognize blood. Outside, distant sirens began rising through the trees. Not local police. Federal vehicles. Reaper must have called them once the holding room was confirmed. Good. Now the machine would die publicly. But Mason looked down at the child in his arms and understood something bigger. Victor Hayes's empire wasn't just collapsing. It was still trying to grow, through children, through future names, through living heirs. And tonight, they had cut out its final heart. The first federal SUVs broke through the St. Mercy gates, just as Mason carried the Creed boy out of the holding room. Blue and red lights washed across the chapel walls, turning the painted angels and children's murals into something almost grotesque, a lie collapsing under law. The other 2 children stayed close to Elena and Hollow, wrapped in blankets, too exhausted to fully understand that the nightmare was ending. But the little boy in Mason's arms never took his eyes off the silver eagle patch, like he already knew. Like blood recognized blood before names ever could. Agents flooded the basement archive within seconds. Financial crimes, family services, federal child protection, all of it moving at once. This was no longer just a corruption case. It had become a national inheritance trafficking investigation. Jax opened another cabinet drawer as the agents photographed everything. Rows of files, emergency custody transfers, death certificate amendments, dormant trust activations waiting for minors to turn 18. Victor Hayes hadn't only been stealing land, he had been manufacturing heirs, building legal ownership pipelines through children. One of the federal women in a navy jacket looked up from the drawer. "Oh my God," Mason turned. She held a sealed red folder labeled Phase 2, Continuation, Heirs/Active County Expansion. Walter had been right. This was the future arm of the empire, not the past. Victor planned to rebuild through surviving minors once the old bloodlines died off. The woman flipped the folder open. Inside were 6 active targets. The first 5 were ranch families already named in Robert's master ledger, but the 6th made Elena go white. Creed Auto and Iron, final consolidation through minor trust heir. The boy in Mason's arms. Victor planned to use him to reclaim the garage if Mason or Elena ever died without issue. A generational failsafe. The last legal trap. The boy looked up at Mason. "Am I in trouble?" The innocence in the question hit harder than the tunnel fire. Mason adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. "No." His voice stayed low. "Certain. You're going home." Outside, dawn's first light was already starting to touch the eastern tree line. The night had disappeared inside action. By the time the convoy returned to Creed Auto and Iron, the county was awake. And this time, the whole town was waiting. Cars lined Route 16. Families stood near the gravel lot. Farmers, widows, mechanics, ranch owners, people clutching old folders, faded deeds, marriage certificates, and probate notices. News had spread from the courthouse to St. Mercy. Everyone now knew Robert Creed's vault ledger existed. Everyone now knew their names may have been stolen. The Creed garage had become ground zero for restoration. Walter stood in the bay doorway as Mason stepped from the truck carrying the child. The old man froze, not from the boy, from the surname bracelet. Creed. His bruised hand trembled. Then he crossed the concrete faster than his ribs should have allowed. The boy stared at him. "You're Walter." Nobody had introduced him. Walter's eyes filled instantly. "How do you know my name?" The child lifted the silver eagle toy. "Grandma Anna said the old mechanic would still be waiting." Silence swallowed the entire lot. Even the crowd outside seemed to feel the moment. Anna had known. Even buried under Hayes's lies, she kept the final bloodline signal alive. Walter knelt slowly despite the pain. The boy stepped into his arms. 3 generations of surviving Creed bloodline meeting in the same garage Victor tried to erase. Elena covered her mouth, tears finally falling without restraint. Mason stood still, watching the rebuild evolve into something bigger than justice. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was restoration at scale. A family line once split by murder, marriage fraud, and identity laundering now standing under the same roof again. But the federal woman from St. Mercy stepped into the garage with another sealed evidence pouch. Her expression was grim. "We found one more live file." She handed it directly to Mason. Inside, a probate transfer already scheduled for tomorrow morning. Emergency judge signature. Temporary sealed session. Victor Hayes may have been in custody, but someone inside the court system was still trying to activate the child heir trust trap. The garage, the ridge, the remaining Hayes shell holdings, all of it. One last legal hand was still moving. Jax looked over Mason's shoulder. "Someone's still playing for Victor." The judge's name sat stamped across the bottom. Honorable Miriam Cole. Walter's bruised face darkened instantly. Cole was Victor's probate fixer 15 years before Pierce. That meant the final surviving head of the inheritance machine was not in the orphanage, not in the bypass office, not in Victor's shell company. It was still alive inside the courthouse. One judge, one emergency sealed hearing, one last chance to steal the Creed future through a child. Mason looked down at the boy in Walter's arms, then at Elena, then at the packed lot full of families holding stolen names in their hands. Tomorrow morning wasn't about one child anymore. It was about every surviving heir in Oak Ridge County. The courthouse would become the final battlefield, not with fists, with bloodlines, with restored deeds, with living heirs standing in daylight. Victor Hayes built his empire by rewriting names in hidden rooms. Tomorrow Mason would destroy the final piece of it in the one place it had always worn respectability, open court. And this time, the entire county would be watching. By sunrise, the courthouse steps were no longer just stone. They had become a line in history. The entire front square of Oak Ridge County was packed shoulder to shoulder. Farmers holding faded land grants, widows clutching probate folders, mechanics with grease-stained envelopes, ranch families carrying birth certificates older than the courthouse itself. Every face in the crowd carried the same question. Was our name ever really ours? News drones circled above the square. National media vans now stretched across Main Street. The Hayes scandal had gone far beyond local corruption. The phrase, inheritance trafficking, was running across every national ticker. And today, the final surviving arm of Victor Hayes's machine would either die in daylight or steal the Creed future one last time. Mason stood at the foot of the courthouse stairs beside Elena, Walter, and the little Creed boy wrapped in Robert's old leather riding jacket. The silver eagle stitched on the toy in his hand glinted in the cold morning sun. A living heir. The one Victor's probate trap still needed. Walter looked up at the courthouse doors. His bruises had darkened overnight, but his spine had never looked straighter. Miriam Cole won't expect this many witnesses. Mason's eyes stayed on the upper windows. She's not getting a closed hearing. At exactly 8:55, the doors opened. Judge Miriam Cole stepped onto the upper landing, mid-60s, silver hair, perfect black robe, the kind of public face built on decades of clean respectability. But Mason had seen her younger face already, in Robert's vault photographs, standing beside Victor Hayes in the Ridge Chamber, watching fuel drums and trust papers move through illegal channels. She had been part of the machine since the beginning. Her gaze moved over the crowd, then landed on the child. For one split second, panic. Tiny. But there, she recovered fast. "This is a sealed probate hearing involving a protected minor," she announced. "The public must clear the square." Nobody moved, not 1 inch. Instead, families began stepping forward, one by one, holding their documents high. Benson, Marlowe, Hastings, Creed. Dozens of original county bloodlines physically present in front of the court, the exact thing Robert's master ledger was built for. Public restoration. Cole's jaw tightened. "This proceeding is protected by emergency inheritance statute." Elena stepped forward before Mason could, her voice cut clean through the crowd. "That statute was written by Victor Hayes's probate committee in 2008. The crowd erupted, murmurs turning into outrage. Even the cameras shifted closer. Mason stepped onto the first courthouse stair, then the second, until he stood directly below Cole's landing. He held up the master ledger. The black leather book caught the morning light like a verdict. "Every stolen bloodline in this county is in here," Mason said, "including the child you're trying to use to reclaim Creed Auto and Iron." Cole's expression hardened. "That ledger is inadmissible." A new voice shattered the square. "No." Federal badges flashed through the crowd. RICO prosecutors, Child Inheritance Trafficking Division, Probate Fraud Task Force. The same federal woman from St. Mercy stepped onto the courthouse stairs beside Mason. Her voice rang across the square. "It is now federal evidence." Cole's face finally cracked. Not much, but enough, because the law she hid behind had just been taken away. The prosecutor held up the red Phase 2 file from St. Mercy. "Your Honor, we recovered active continuation heir directives signed under your seal." The cameras exploded, flashes, microphones, shouting. Cole tried one final move. "This child's identity remains under Hayes Family Protective Trust." That was the line she thought still saved her. The legal chain Victor built into the last surviving Creed heir. But Walter stepped forward, slow, painfully, yet every eye in the square followed him. The old mechanic raised Anna Creed's original birth record in one hand and Robert's trust restoration in the other. His voice carried with the force of 40 buried years. "The boy's bloodline was never Hayes." Silence, pure silence. Walter looked at the child, then back at Cole. "He belongs to Creed." The boy stepped out from Elena's side, small, wrapped in leather, silver eagle toy clutched to his chest. Then he said the one thing Anna had preserved across generations. "The eagle came back, so I came home." That line broke the square. People cried openly. Families began lifting their own documents higher, not anger anymore. Recognition. This wasn't just a courthouse case. This was a public return of stolen names. Cole's voice faltered. "Bailiffs!" But there were no bailiffs coming, because state marshals were already moving up the rear courthouse corridor. Her private probate chamber had been raided 10 minutes earlier. Every sealed hearing file seized, every dormant trust activation recovered. She turned to flee. Mason moved fast. Not violence. Precision. He stepped aside just as the federal marshals reached the landing. Judge Miriam Cole was placed in cuffs on the courthouse steps in full view of every camera in the country. The final respectable mask of Victor Hayes's inheritance machine collapsed in broad daylight. The square erupted, not chaos, release, families hugging, people crying, old ranchers reading restored names from copied ledger pages. the Creed boy looking up at Walter with the calm certainty only children carry. And above it all, the courthouse bell rang 9 times, the exact moment the sealed hearing was meant to begin. Instead, it became the official restoration of every stolen inheritance in Oak Ridge County. The prosecutor handed Mason a final document, emergency federal injunction. All Hayes lineage trusts dissolved, all minor inheritance traps voided, all original bloodline claims restored pending verification. The boy's legal name was printed on the first line. Elias Creed. The final surviving child heir was free. The crowd saw the surname. Then the entire square began chanting one word: Creed. Again. Louder. Creed. Victor Hayes spent decades rewriting names in hidden rooms. This morning the county wrote them back in sunlight, but as Mason looked over the square full of reclaimed families, he understood the real ending hadn't arrived yet. Justice had restored the names. Now, someone had to rebuild what those names belonged to. And that meant the Creed legacy was about to become much bigger than one garage, much bigger than one ridge. Oak Ridge County was coming home. By afternoon, Creed Auto and Iron no longer belonged only to the Creed family. It had become the beating heart of an entire county trying to remember its real name. The gravel lot overflowed. Pickup trucks lined Route 16 for nearly half a mile. Families came carrying deed copies freshly released by federal clerks. Ranchers brought rolled land maps. Widows arrived with probate reversals. Mechanics showed up with old shop licenses buried under Hayes shell companies. The chant from the courthouse had followed everyone back. Creed. Not as a surname anymore, as a symbol. A place where stolen legacies were being returned. Inside the garage, Walter sat at the old oak desk while Elena organized family files into separate stacks. Benson claims, Marlowe ranch deeds, Hastings mineral rights. Every restored name from Robert's vault ledger now flowing through the one place Victor Hayes could never erase. The garage had become a restoration center. Jax leaned against the service bay with a grin. "Your granddad's shop just turned into county headquarters." Walter's bruised face cracked into the faintest smile. "About damn time this place did more than oil changes." Even in the middle of legal chaos, the old mechanic was still Walter. Mason stood in Bay 3 beside Robert's rebuilt Harley and watched the flow of people. For the first time since he returned, nobody came carrying fear. They carried hope. That was heavier. Because revenge had a finish line, responsibility didn't. Then Elias Creed, the boy from St. Mercy, walked into the bay holding the silver eagle toy in one hand and Robert's old wrench in the other. He looked up at Mason. "Is this really our garage?" The question hit deeper than any courtroom victory. Mason crouched beside him. "It always was." Elias looked around at the crowded shop. "So why are all these people here?" Before Mason could answer, Elena stepped closer. "Because Victor stole more than one family." The boy thought about that in the direct way only children can. Then he nodded toward the front lot. "So we helped them get home too." Walter looked over from the desk and laughed softly through sore ribs. The kid had already understood Robert's legacy better than most adults. By sunset, the county square outside the garage looked like a festival of reclaimed names. Families compared old photographs. Children played around the parked Harleys. Local businesses arrived with food trucks and coffee tables. The diner owner from Main Street hung a handwritten sign over the garage entrance. Oak Ridge Legacy Restoration. Day news cameras captured every moment. The country was watching what happened when one family refused to stay buried. But then Reaper walked in from the road holding a thick federal envelope. His face serious again. "There's a problem." The energy in the bay shifted immediately. Mason took the envelope. Department of Transportation, Federal Bypass Review Board. Inside was a revised state proposal. The original Hayes bypass route had been frozen, but a new emergency route had already been submitted by state contractors. And the red line on the map cut directly through Creed Ridge's lower preservation zone. The vault. Robert's restoration archive. The family burial plots above the old mine shelf. All of it. Walter stood too fast, wincing. "They're trying to bury the evidence under asphalt." Reaper nodded. "Not Hayes people this time. State wants the fastest economic recovery route." "Different enemy," Same result. The county wanted progress, fast, and Robert's restored land sat in the way. Elena spread the map on the workbench. Her finger traced the red line. If they build this, every surviving family vault record under the ridge gets destabilized, which meant all the restored bloodlines could be challenged again in 10 years, 20, whenever records got lost, damaged, or declared unstable. This was the final respectable version of theft, not corruption, bureaucracy, the kind of thing nobody fought because it looked legal. Mason stared at the route map, then at the packed lot full of families reclaiming their names outside. The county had been restored. Now it needed protection, not just from men like Victor Hayes, from systems that could erase history in the name of progress. Walter slowly walked to Bay 3. His hand rested on Robert's Harley tank. Your father always said legacy isn't what you win. He looked at Mason. It's what you defend after everyone stops watching. That line landed harder than the courthouse chant, because the cameras would leave, the crowds would go home, the headlines would move on, but the ridge would still be vulnerable, and the vault under it held not just Creed history, the entire county's reclaimed bloodlines. Mason folded the route map once, then looked out at the families filling the lot, the Benson ranchers, the Marlowe widows, the Hastings twins playing with Elias near the tool racks. This was bigger than one garage, bigger than Creed. Creed Ridge had become the physical archive of Oak Ridge's true identity. And now the state wanted to carve through it. No, not happening. Mason climbed onto Robert's Harley. The engine roared alive, instantly pulling every face in the lot toward Bay 3. Silence followed. Then he spoke loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. They stole your names in secret. Every conversation stopped. He held the new bypass route map high. Now they want to erase the place where we got them back. The crowd darkened instantly. Not panic, resolve. Families stepped closer, one by one, holding their restored documents. Walter moved to Mason's side. Elena lifted Robert's master ledger. Elias raised the silver eagle toy. The county understood. The war for names was over. The war for memory had just begun. And this time, Mason wouldn't fight with a handful of brothers. He had an entire county behind him. Creed Ridge was no longer just family land. It had become sacred ground. The next battle wouldn't happen in tunnels, orphanages, or courtrooms. It would happen in public, against the state itself. And if they wanted to lay asphalt over the dead, the stolen, and the restored, they were going to have to drive straight through Oak Ridge County first. By dawn the next morning, Creed Ridge looked less like disputed land and more like a line no government surveyor in America should ever cross. The entire lower access road was packed. Pickup trucks, horse trailers, old ranch jeeps, mechanics' vans from Route 16. Even the diner owner had parked her food truck sideways across the gravel shoulder like a barricade. Families stood shoulder to shoulder along the ridge shelf, holding restored deeds, original birth records, and copied pages from Robert's master ledger sealed in plastic sleeves. Oak Ridge County had shown up in force, not angry, rooted, like the mountain itself had called them home. Mason stood at the front beside Robert's Harley, the silver eagle tank catching the sunrise. Behind him, Walter with the original Creed Ridge deed, Elena holding Anna Creed's restored bloodline trust. Elias wrapped in Robert's old leather jacket, silver eagle toy clutched tight, Reaper and the brothers lining the ridge road, dozens of county families whose names had come back because of the vault. The state survey crews arrived at 8:10. 3 white trucks, orange vests, legal clipboards, 2 deputy escorts, no corruption, no Victor Hayes, just procedure. That somehow made it colder. The lead engineer stepped out with a rolled route plan under his arm. He stopped the second he saw the human wall stretching across the ridge shelf. "What is this?" Walter answered first. "History." The man frowned. "This is an authorized emergency economic corridor." Elena lifted the preservation grant papers Hollow found in Part 10. Not through a federally protected historical restoration site. The engineer's face changed. He hadn't expected resistance backed by law. But then another black SUV climbed the road behind the survey trucks. State Transportation Council, 3 lawyers, the kind of people sent when paperwork needed to overpower memory. The oldest woman stepped forward, gray suit, no smile. Federal historical status only protects the upper ridge structures. The new route uses the lower shelf. Mason took the bypass map from his vest, spread it across Robert's Harley tank, then placed Robert's original mine survey beside it. The two lines overlapped perfectly. The new road cut directly over the subvault reinforcement veins. If heavy machinery rolled through, the lower restoration chamber from Part 13 would collapse, along with every original inheritance record stored below. This wasn't construction, it was archival destruction by technicality. The lawyer saw it too, but her voice stayed flat. Collateral instability is not sufficient to halt state infrastructure. That line hit the gathered families like a spark in dry grass. The Benson Ranch widow stepped forward with tears already in her eyes. My husband died before he got his real deed back. A Hastings farmer lifted his restored mineral rights. My daughters just got our land name returned yesterday. Then, more voices. One after another. The entire ridge shelf became testimony. Not in a courtroom, in open air. Real people with real names standing on the ground those names belonged to. The lawyers hadn't prepared for emotion, but Mason knew emotion alone wouldn't stop bulldozers. He needed something stronger. Then Elias tugged his sleeve. The boy pointed toward the ridgestone marker beside the false cave-in shaft, a weathered bronze plaque half buried in dust. Nobody had paid attention to it before. Walter's eyes widened. Oh my God! Mason brushed the dirt away. The inscription emerged: Oak Ridge, Memorial Miners. Burial site. 1919, silence hit the ridge, hard. The entire lower shelf wasn't just archival land. It was a registered burial zone from the original mine collapse. Unmarked graves, historic labor dead. State law changed instantly. Even the transportation lawyers knew it. The older attorney stepped forward fast. Let me see that. Walter already had the matching old mine casualty ledger in his hands. Another hidden creed document. Of course he did. 27 miners buried under the lower shelf after the collapse. Family names still active in the county. Benson, Marlowe, Hastings, Creed. The exact same bloodlines Victor Hayes later targeted, because the land above their ancestors' graves held the inheritance chain. This ridge was never just strategic. It was sacred in the oldest possible way. The state council lowered her papers slowly. Construction over a registered burial site would trigger federal cultural protection, tribal review, labor memorial law, and historical preservation freezes. Months, maybe years. The route was dead. The crowd felt it before she spoke. We are suspending the emergency corridor pending federal memorial review. The ridge erupted. Not cheering, something deeper. Release, old widows crying, farmers embracing, children holding restored family names while standing above the bones that started them. Elias looked up at Mason. So they can't take it now? Mason knelt beside him. No. The boy looked at the mountain. Because family is under it. Mason glanced at Walter. The old man's bruised face broke into the clearest smile since the story began. That's exactly why. The state trucks turned around one by one. Survey crews packed their tripods. Deputies rolled back down the road. The threat disappeared into morning light. But the crowd didn't leave. Instead, the county families began placing flowers, old photographs, and copied deed papers along the ridge marker. A spontaneous memorial. Not just for the miners, for every buried name that came back because of them. Elena stepped beside Mason. We didn't just save the vault. She looked across the families gathered on sacred ground. We gave the county its roots back. That was the real victory. Victor Hayes stole the living. The state almost erased the dead, but the ridge had protected both. As the sun climbed higher over Oak Ridge, Mason looked at Robert's Harley, Walter, Elna, Elias, and the long line of restored families standing over the mountain. The war had finally evolved beyond revenge, inheritance, and legal restoration. Now it was about legacy in the deepest sense, protecting the dead so the living could keep their names. And with the road defeated, the county now had something it never had before, a reason to build forward without ever forgetting what lay beneath. The next chapter wouldn't be about stopping destruction. It would be about creating something permanent on Creed Ridge, a place where every stolen bloodline, every buried miner, and every restored family could be remembered together. a living monument. And Mason already knew exactly where it would begin. Bay 3, the garage, the place where all the names first came home. 3 days later, Bay 3 no longer looked like the hidden nerve center of a family war. It looked like the birthplace of a county's future. The secret floor hatch still existed beneath the hydraulic lift. The restoration vault below the ridge remained federally sealed and now fully protected as a memorial archive. But above ground, Creed Auto and Iron had transformed again, this time by choice. Workbenches had been pushed back, the central bay floor was polished clean. New timber beams lined the walls where the shattered glass had once been. And mounted above Robert's old workbench, under a spotlight of warm steel light, hung the black leather sign Elena had spent all night sketching by hand. The Oak Ridge Legacy Foundation. Families kept arriving, not for deeds anymore, for contribution. Old miners' helmets, family photographs, marriage licenses with restored surnames, handwritten ranch journals, mechanic shop licenses returned from Hayes shell companies. Every family wanted part of the future memorial. Walter sat at the oak desk with reading glasses balanced low on his nose, cataloging each item in a new ledger. A real ledger this time, not one built to hide theft, one built to preserve truth. Mason stood in Bay 3 beside Elias, showing him how to hold Robert's old measuring caliper. The boy's small hands shook with concentration. "Like this?" "Steady," Mason said. Elias adjusted. The measurement locked perfectly. Walter looked over with the faintest smile. "Runs in the blood." That line hit Elena harder than anyone else. She stood beside the new foundation wall where Anna Creed's photograph had just been mounted next to Robert's, and the original 1919 miner's plaque recovered from the ridge marker. For the first time, Anna's name stood openly under Creed. No Hayes, no false trust surname. Home. Outside, the county was building too. The diner owner had already organized a yearly Ridge Memorial ride. The Benson ranchers donated timber for a memorial walkway up the burial shelf. The Hastings twins designed a digital family tree wall that would let every restored bloodline trace its true name back through the vault records. The whole county had shifted from reclaiming names to honoring them. That was when the black federal sedan arrived. No sirens, no urgency, just finality. The federal prosecutor from the courthouse stepped out carrying a sealed leather folder. Everyone in the garage felt the energy change. This wasn't another threat. This was ending paperwork. She walked straight to Mason. "It's done." The folder opened onto the workbench. Inside, final RICO conviction notice for Victor Hayes, permanent dissolution of all Hayes Shell Trusts, federal transfer of all fraud-seized charitable and land assets, memorial preservation grant approval for Creed Ridge, and one final page. The Oak Ridge Restoration and Bloodline Trust. Mason read the final clause twice. All recovered Hayes assets not tied to criminal victims were being transferred into a permanent county trust under joint stewardship of Mason Creed, Elena Creed, Walter Creed, Elias Creed. The restored Oak Ridge family council. Victor Hayes had spent decades building an empire through stolen names. Now the remains of that empire would fund the people he erased. The perfect inversion. Walter removed his glasses slowly. Robert would have liked that. The prosecutor smiled for the first time. He planned it better than most federal task forces. That felt true. Even now, Robert Creed's hand was still guiding the final structure. Elena signed first, then Walter, then Mason. When Elias reached for the pen, the prosecutor gently lowered the trust page. "This signature line is for when he turns 18. The boy frowned. "So I'm too little to help?" Walter laughed softly. "No." He handed Elias the old silver eagle stamp from Robert's tool chest. The boy pressed it into the trust wax seal. A child's mark, a family seal, a future written in symbol before law. The room went silent. Because everyone understood the meaning, the final surviving Creed child heir had just officially marked the foundation that would preserve every stolen bloodline in the county. Not as victim, as steward. The garage doors stood open to the late afternoon sun. Outside, motorcycles lined the lot, families gathered around food tables, Children ran between parked trucks holding restored surname cards like treasure maps. The Ridge Memorial Ride banners were already being painted for the first annual ceremony. The county wasn't healing quietly. It was rebuilding publicly. Then Walter rose from the desk, slow, careful, but stronger than anyone had seen him since the assault. He walked to Robert's Harley, rested one bruised hand on the Silver Eagle tank, then looked at Mason. "Your father saved the names." His eyes moved to the foundation wall, to the ridge, to Anna, to Elias, then back to the crowded lot outside. "You made sure they had somewhere to live." That was the real ending. Not Victor's prison sentence, not the courthouse chant, not the tunnel fire truth. A place, a living place where names, land, blood, and memory would remain together. Bay 3. The same floor that once hid fear now housed legacy. As sunset poured orange light through the garage, Mason looked around the transformed shop, Robert's Harley in the center bay, Anna's photograph restored, the miner's memorial plaque, the foundation wall, Walter smiling, Elena finally wearing the Creed name openly, Elias stamping family documents with the Silver Eagle, and outside, an entire county no longer afraid of forgetting who they were. Only one chapter remained, not revenge, not restoration, legacy in motion. Tomorrow morning, the first Ridge Memorial Ride would climb the mountain, every restored family together, over the burial ground, past the vault, to the memorial site above the ridge where Oak Ridge County would write its names into stone, forever. The mountain road to Creed Ridge had never seen a morning like this. At first light, the sound began. One Harley, then another, then 10, then 50. By the time the sun cleared the eastern hills, the entire ridge road had become a river of chrome, leather, pickup trucks, horse trailers, and families walking on foot with children beside them. Not a procession of fear, a procession of return. The first Ridge Memorial Ride had begun. Mason led at the front on Robert Creed's restored Harley. The Silver Eagle on the tank caught the sunrise so brightly it looked almost alive. Beside him rode Elena on Anna's newly restored Heritage bike Walter had rebuilt from old storage parts through the night. Behind them, Reaper and the brothers, the Benson Ranch family, carrying the 1919 miner's lantern, the Hastings twins with the digital family tree tablet, widows holding restored marriage certificates, mechanics from half the county children wearing paper surname badges pinned to denim jackets, Walter in the passenger seat of the lead truck with Elias beside him, the Silver Eagle toy in his lap. No one rushed. This ride wasn't about speed. It was about witness. The road climbed past the old tunnel gate, past the memorial burial marker that had stopped the state road, past the lower shelf where flowers still covered the miner's plaque, and finally it reached the new memorial site on the upper ridge. Overnight, the county had transformed the clearing. A stone circle stood at the center, black granite pillars rising in a ring, each pillar engraved with one restored Oak Ridge bloodline. Creed, Benson, Marlowe, Hastings, and dozens more. At the center of the ring stood a bronze eagle with wings spread over the names. Robert's symbol. Now the county's. Families dismounted and stepped into the clearing slowly. No media drones today, no federal agents, no sirens. Only mountain wind, sunlight, and the sound of people reading their own names carved permanently into stone. Walter stepped out of the truck with Elias holding his hand. The old mechanic stopped the moment he saw Robert and Anna's names engraved side by side beneath the bronze eagle. His face folded under the weight of everything that had led here. The fire, the lies, the tunnel, the courthouse, the child saved from St. Mercy, the ridge protected. And now, this. Home written into granite. Elias looked up at the pillar. "That's us." Walter's voice cracked in the softest way. "Yeah, kid." He squeezed the boy's shoulder gently. "That's us forever." Elena moved to Anna's name and laid down the old photograph she had carried since the courthouse. For the first time in decades, Anna Creed stood openly where Victor Hayes could never bury her again. The Hastings twins activated the digital wall tablet mounted beside the memorial. The screen lit up with branching family trees restored from Robert's vault ledger. Lines once broken by fraud now reconnecting in real time. Children crowded around it, tracing surnames with their fingers and finding grandparents they never knew belonged to them. The county had turned restoration into inheritance. Then, Walter stepped into the center of the stone ring. No speech prepared, no grand performance, just truth. He looked at every family gathered there, then at Mason, then at Elias. Victor Hayes thought names were paper. The mountain went silent. Walter's bruised hand rested against the creed pillar. But names are land, blood, memory, graves, the people who come back when the eagle rides. Several widows openly cried, ranchers lowered their hats, children stared up at the bronze eagle. Walter turned toward Robert's Harley parked at the edge of the clearing. My son died making sure truth had somewhere to survive. Then his eyes moved to Bay 3, visible far below in the valley where the garage roof caught the morning sun. Mason made sure it had somewhere to live. That was it. No dramatic ending, because the mountain itself finished the story. Mason stepped forward and placed Robert's silver wrench into a glass memorial case beneath the bronze eagle. The same wrench he carried into the lower vault, the same one that opened the path back to every stolen name. Now it stayed here, not as evidence, as beginning. Elias walked up beside him holding the silver eagle toy. He placed it next to the wrench. A child's offering. Future beside legacy. The entire ridge clearing felt it. This wasn't a memorial to death. It was a living contract between generations. The Oak Ridge Legacy Foundation would preserve the vaults. The garage would remain the restoration center. The annual ride would bring every family back to the ridge, and every child born into those bloodlines would grow up knowing exactly where their name came from. As the sun rose fully over the mountain, the bronze eagle cast a shadow across every family pillar at once. One wing over all of them, Robert's final protection extending farther than he ever lived to see. Mason looked out over the county below, the garage, the preserved ridge, the memorial road. The families gathered around names they almost lost forever. Victor Hayes was gone. The courts were finished. The road was stopped. The orphan heirs were safe. The vault was protected. The bloodlines were restored. And now Oak Ridge County had something stronger than justice. Memory with a home. Walter stood beside Mason at the edge of the ridge. For a long time, neither man said anything. Then, the old mechanic looked down toward the valley and gave the final line Robert should have heard years ago. We kept it, son. The wind carried the words over Creed Ridge, across the memorial stones, down to the garage, through the county, into every restored name. And for the first time in 22 years, nothing needed to be buried anymore.